Stay. I need to talk to someone.
Of course, sir.
It's been a long time since I felt like that.
I'm here to listen.
Nobody warns you that the most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is feel something. Not his enemies, not his lawyers, not the 7 armed guards rotating shifts outside his estate every night like a very expensive, very serious carousel. Nobody pulls the untouchable boss aside and says, "Sir, with respect, loneliness is the only weapon your enemies haven't tried yet." They probably should have. Before we go further, if you've ever watched a powerful man meet the one person he couldn't intimidate, you already know this story hits different. Like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe. Because the people who won't, they're probably team betrayal. And we saw how that ended. Seoul didn't sleep. It just changed shifts. At 2 in the morning, the Han River glittered below a sky too polluted for stars, and Kang Min-sok stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his study, watching the city pulse with the quiet satisfaction of a man who owned considerable pieces of it. Not legally, of course. Legally, he was the chairman of 3 holding companies, a philanthropic foundation, and a logistics firm whose paperwork was so impeccably boring that auditors routinely fell asleep reviewing it. That was by design. What wasn't on the paperwork? The port agreements that moved things governments preferred not to inspect. The private security contracts that kept certain politicians sleeping soundly while keeping others from sleeping at all. The quiet architecture of influence that had taken Min-sok 15 years to build, one careful decision at a time, until the Kang organization sat beneath Seoul's legitimate economy like bedrock, invisible, structural, and impossible to remove without bringing everything above it down too. He was 38 years old, and he had, by any rational measure, won. The problem was that winning at this altitude looked almost identical to being alone in a very expensive room at 2 in the morning. He turned from the window. The study was immaculate. Dark wood, curated silence, a whiskey he'd been nursing for an hour without actually tasting. On his desk, 3 separate intelligence reports waited in sealed folders. The names inside them were men he had trusted. Past tense. The betrayal had moved faster than he'd anticipated, which was its own kind of humiliation. Not because it hurt, but because he hadn't seen it coming, and Kang Min-sok had built his entire reputation on seeing things coming. A shipment, seized. 2 lieutenants, arrested. Worse, paid off. Not desperate men making bad choices under pressure, but men who had calculated their odds, looked at both sides of the scale, and quietly decided that someone else's loyalty paid better. He had a cut across his right palm from the glass he'd broken when he found out. 4 stitches from his private physician who had asked no questions and submitted no paperwork, because that was also what the salary covered. The house had gone very still when he'd arrived home. Staff had a way of sensing his moods before he entered rooms, some organizational sixth sense, or perhaps simply the survival instinct of people who understood that proximity to power required reading weather patterns carefully. By the time he'd reached the main hall, the corridors were emptied with impressive efficiency. Even Director Huang, his head of security, and a man who had once stared down a loaded weapon without adjusting his expression, had found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. Everyone except her. He'd been in the sitting room, hand wrapped in a cloth that was rapidly losing the argument with the bleeding, when Amara Okafor walked in carrying tea he hadn't asked for and a small first aid kit she had apparently retrieved without fuss or announcement. She was 29, originally from Lagos. Employed 6 months ago through an agency whose vetting process Min-sok's people had reviewed twice because he reviewed everything twice. Her file was unremarkable in the best possible way. Professional history across 3 countries, spotless references, a quiet competence that apparently manifested as rearranging flower displays in his East Corridor because they were blocking emergency exits on her 3rd day of employment. He had read that incident report and felt something he eventually identified as amusement. It had been a while since he'd felt that. She sat across from him now, not because he had asked her to, but because the first aid kit required proximity, and Amara Okafor was apparently not fluent in the language of institutional fear that everyone else in his household had learned to speak fluently. She cleaned the cut. She said nothing performative. No trembling, no excessive apology, no careful arrangement of her face into the expression of someone hoping not to be fired. She looked at him, directly at him, and said, "You look tired." 3 words, no footnotes, no softening. He stared at her. In 15 years, across boardrooms and back rooms and every negotiation in between, nobody, not one person, had said anything that simple and that true to his face. He didn't answer. But somewhere beneath the cold architecture of everything Kang Min-sok had built himself into, something very old and very quiet shifted. And that, as it turned out, was where the trouble started. The morning after the kitchen incident, which was what Min-sok was calling it inside his head, because giving it a more honest name felt premature and professionally embarrassing, he did what any rational, disciplined, deeply unsentimental criminal executive would do. He reviewed the security footage. Twice. Then a third time at a slightly different angle, which told him absolutely nothing new, except that he apparently needed something to do with his hands at 6 in the morning that wasn't thinking about a conversation that had lasted 4 minutes and produced no actionable intelligence whatsoever. He closed the laptop. He was fine. Amara Okafor's morning began, as it always did, with a list. She was a list person, had been since childhood when her mother, a woman who raised 4 children in Lagos on the salary of a school administrator and the sheer organizational force of her personality, had pressed a small notebook into 8-year-old Amara's hands and said, "Write down what needs doing. The world is chaos. You are not." The notebook had evolved into a phone app. The philosophy had not changed. Today's list: polish the second-floor banisters, restock the East linen cupboard, coordinate with the kitchen about the Thursday delivery, and added this morning in slightly more deliberate handwriting than usual, "Do not make it weird." That last item was directed at herself. She was a professional. She had worked in a Russian billionaire's lake house in Geneva, a tech founder's compound outside Singapore, and a minor royal's townhouse in London, where the main occupational hazard was navigating the family's passive-aggressive relationship with their own butler. She had seen powerful men in their unguarded moments before. She knew what it looked like when the performance dropped for 30 seconds and the actual human being behind it blinked into the light like something that hadn't seen sun in a while. She had handed him tea, cleaned a cut, and said 4 words. That was it. That was the whole thing. She repeated this to herself with great conviction while polishing the same section of banister for the 3rd time. What Amara didn't know, what very few people inside the estate knew, was that the morning had brought news that shifted the situation from tense to surgical. Director Huang placed the report on Min-sok's desk at 7:15 with the expression of a man delivering a diagnosis he personally found offensive. The 3rd name had surfaced. Not just the 2 lieutenants already in custody. A 3rd operative, still inside the organization, still receiving a salary, still attending internal briefings with the calm confidence of someone who had not yet been identified. The rival faction, the Seo network, old money turned new crime, with the patience of people who had been waiting for Min-sok to make a human error, had been more thorough than anticipated. They had placed someone close. Very close. How close? Min-sok asked without looking up from the report. Huang's pause was 1 second too long. Household adjacent, he said finally, which was the professional way of saying, inside your walls, sir, not outside them. Min-sok set the report down with the careful movement of a man ensuring that nothing in his expression confirmed anything to anyone watching. It was a skill he had refined over 15 years, the ability to receive catastrophic information and respond with the emotional bandwidth of someone hearing a mildly inconvenient weather forecast. Internally, however, something cold and specific moved through him. Household adjacent. He thought about the East Corridor flower arrangement report from 6 months ago, the quiet professionalism, the references, the agency. Then he thought about himself at 6 in the morning, reviewing security footage of a 4-minute conversation because he apparently had nothing better to do, and he recognized, with the brutal self-awareness that had kept him alive this long, exactly what kind of target that made him. A man who had survived 15 years of criminal infrastructure by being unreadable had apparently become extremely readable to anyone paying attention. He looked at Huang. Double the internal surveillance. Nobody on household staff is cleared for movement between wings without sign-off. Nobody. He paused, and quietly. Huang nodded and left. Min-sok turned back to the window. The city was awake now, bright, indifferent, going about its business in the way cities do, completely unbothered by the quiet wars being fought inside the buildings that defined its skyline. He thought about 4 words. You look tired. The honest ones always cost the most. The thing about secrets in a closed household is that they travel the same way rumors do in a small village, not through announcements, but through silences. The way a conversation stops when someone enters a room. The way eyes move without heads turning. The way ordinary people suddenly become very interested in their shoes. Amara noticed it on Tuesday. She couldn't name it precisely. It was more of a texture than a fact. Something in the air of the staff quarters that felt different from the usual low-grade tension of working in a house where the employer could, theoretically, make your career disappear with a single phone call. This was sharper, more specific, the kind of atmosphere that forms when people know something is coming and have collectively decided that the safest position is facing away from it. She added it to her mental list. Below banister polish, above do not make it weird. And she went about her work. The surveillance changes were subtle enough that most staff wouldn't notice. Amara noticed. She noticed because she was, by both nature and professional training, an observer. The kind of person who registers detail not out of suspicion, but out of the same quiet instinct that makes some people good at their jobs and occasionally exhausting at dinner parties. She noticed that the camera in the west hallway had been repositioned by approximately 15 degrees. She noticed that the guard rotation had shifted by 30 minutes without any announcement. She noticed that Director Huang, who normally moved through the estate with the energy of a man perpetually late for something important, had slowed down considerably and was watching doorways. She did not, however, notice the man who had been watching her. His name was Shin Jae-won, 41, employed as part of the external grounds maintenance team for 7 months, 1 month longer than Amara herself. He was unremarkable in the specific way that useful operatives train themselves to be unremarkable. Average height, forgettable face, the kind of person your eyes move past at a buffet table without registering. He had a gift for being present without being seen. For the past 3 weeks, J1 had been filing quiet reports to a contact inside the SEO network. The reports were not about logistics or shipments or any of the organizational intelligence his handlers had originally hoped for. They were about something more valuable. They were about patterns. Specifically, the pattern of a particular household employee who crossed paths with Kang Min-sok with a frequency that exceeded professional necessity, and a particular criminal boss who had, on 2 documented occasions, remained in a room longer than his schedule required when that employee was present. The SEO network was not interested in the story. They were interested in the leverage. Min-sok read the preliminary findings from his internal investigation at noon, standing at his desk because sitting felt too comfortable for the occasion. 3 weeks of careful internal surveillance had confirmed what Huang had suspected. J1 was the conduit, not the architect. He wasn't senior enough for that, but the pipe through which information was flowing out, steadily, in small enough quantities that it hadn't triggered alarms until someone knew to look specifically for it. What troubled Min-sok more than the leak itself was what was being leaked. It wasn't operational. It wasn't financial. The SEO network had access to better financial intelligence through their government contacts than anything J1 could observe from a garden. They were collecting something personal. He sat down, after all. In 15 years, nobody had thought to come at him this way. They'd tried financial pressure, legal exposure, physical threat, and the occasional elaborate attempt at blackmail involving photographs that underestimated how little he cared about his public reputation. Nobody had thought to simply wait for him to feel something and then quietly point a camera at it. It was, he admitted privately, almost elegant. In a deeply irritating way. He thought about Amara moving through her day somewhere in the floors below him, completely unaware that she had become a variable in someone else's equation. She hadn't asked for that, hadn't done anything except to be exactly who she was, direct, unimpressed, honest in the specific way that people who don't need anything from you tend to be honest. She had told him he looked tired, and someone had decided to build a weapon out of it. Min-sok closed the folder. Then he picked up his phone and made 2 calls, both short, both quiet, both the kind of calls that in Seoul's underworld functioned less like conversations and more like weather changes. By evening, Shin Jae-won would no longer be employed on the grounds. By morning, the SEO network would know that Kang Min-sok had noticed them noticing him, and that, historically, was where their problems began. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a household when the staff knows something has changed, but hasn't been told what. It is not the quiet of peace, it is the quiet of people breathing carefully. Shin Jae-won was gone by Wednesday morning, no announcement, no explanation. His tools were cleared from the groundskeeper's shed, his access card deactivated, his name removed from the rotation sheet with the clean efficiency of an organization that had done this before and would do it again, and considered drama an unnecessary operational expense. By Thursday, 2 of the younger gardening staff had quietly asked Director Huang if everything was all right. Huang had looked at them with the expression of a man who found the question philosophically interesting, but professionally irrelevant. They did not ask again. Amara heard about it the way she heard most things in the estate, sideways, in fragments, through the particular conversational architecture of people who wanted to share information without technically being the ones who shared it. Mrs. Park, the head housekeeper, mentioned during the linen inventory that the grounds team was being restructured. One of the kitchen staff mentioned, unprompted and with suspicious casualness, that it was probably nothing. When people tell you something is probably nothing, Amara had learned, it is almost never nothing. She filed it, said nothing. completed the linen inventory with her usual precision, and went about her afternoon. What she could not file quite as neatly was the conversation she'd had that morning with Director Huang. Brief, professional, and delivered with the specific energy of a man reading from a script he personally found uncomfortable. Effective immediately, household staff movement between the residential wings and the main floor required advance sign-off. It was a security measure. It was temporary. It was nothing to be concerned about. He had looked, while saying this, extremely concerned. Amara had thanked him, confirmed she understood, and waited until he left before sitting down on the edge of the linen cupboard for 30 seconds of very private recalibration. Something was happening in this house. Something that had started quietly and was now moving with the low, pressurized energy of a situation gathering toward a point. She had worked in enough complicated households to recognize the feeling. The moment when the background hum of managed tension shifts into something with direction and momentum. The question was whether she was adjacent to it or inside it. Min Sok had spent Thursday in back-to-back meetings that were technically about logistics and functionally about consequences. The CO network had received his message. The removal of J1 was a message, clean and unambiguous. The organizational equivalent of placing a chess piece down with slightly more force than necessary. By afternoon, he had confirmation through 3 separate channels that the message had landed. The response, relayed through an intermediary who specialized in this kind of careful, deniable communication, was essentially, "We were only watching," which was, Min Sok reflected, the most alarming possible response. People who were only watching were people still gathering. People who moved early were people who'd made a decision. Watchers were patient. And the CO network had already demonstrated, through 18 months of quiet preparation before the March betrayal, that patience was their primary competitive advantage. He dismissed his last meeting at 7 in the evening and sat alone in his office with the particular stillness of a man running calculations. They hadn't moved against Amara directly. That was deliberate. Direct action against a household employee would force his hand immediately. He would respond, visibly, and in responding confirm exactly what they suspected about his vulnerability. They were smarter than that. They were content to let the leverage accumulate quietly, let the file thicken, and wait for a moment when it could be deployed at maximum impact. The correct move was to eliminate the variable. He knew what that meant. Professionally, structurally, it was the only clean solution. Amara Okafor should be quietly reassigned, good reference, generous severance, no explanation that would alarm her. And the specific, inconvenient softness she had somehow produced in him should be filed under operational hazards and left there. He had made harder decisions than this before breakfast. He picked up the phone, put it back down, picked it up again. His thumb hovered over Huang's contact for a long moment. Then he set the phone face down on the desk, stood up, and walked downstairs to the kitchen, because it was nearly 8 o'clock and he hadn't eaten, and that was the only reason. That was absolutely the only reason. She was arranging the Thursday delivery inventory when he walked in. She looked up. No flinching, no performance. "Are you hungry?" she asked, like it was simple, like he was just a person. He sat down at the kitchen counter. "Yes," he said. She made him rice. Not the elaborate, architecturally considered meals that his private chef produced for dinner events. The kind of food that looked like it had been assembled by someone with a design degree and a concerning relationship with tweezers. Just clean, simple rice with a fried egg and sliced cucumber on the side, seasoned with sesame oil and a pinch of salt, produced from the Thursday delivery ingredients with the calm efficiency of someone who cooked the way she did everything else. Without fanfare, without requesting applause. He ate the whole thing. He couldn't remember the last time he'd done that. They didn't talk much during the meal. Amara moved around the kitchen finishing her inventory, and Min Sok sat at the counter eating in a silence that was remarkably not uncomfortable. This was itself unusual. Silence around Kang Min Sok was typically the architectural kind, the silence of people constructing careful distance, arranging themselves at safe angles, ensuring that nothing they did could later be interpreted as presumption. This was just quiet, the ordinary kind. Rain against the kitchen window, the soft scratch of her pen against the inventory clipboard, the unremarkable sounds of a house at night. He finished eating and watched her work for a moment. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It came out less like an accusation and more like an observation he'd been sitting on for 6 months. She didn't look up from the clipboard. "Should I be? Most people are. Most people work for you." She made a small tick against an item on her list. "I work in your house. There's a difference." He considered this. "That's a thin distinction. It's actually quite a wide one." Now she looked up with the expression of someone making a reasonable point to a person who had the intelligence to understand it if they tried. Your employees need you to think well of them. I need you to think I'm doing my job correctly. One of those is much easier to manage. Min-sok looked at her for a long moment. And are you? Doing your job correctly? The linen inventory is done, the Thursday delivery is logged, and your kitchen is cleaner than it was an hour ago. She set the clipboard down. You tell me, he almost smiled. Almost. This was the part that the CO network had correctly identified and catastrophically misunderstood. They had seen the proximity and assumed weakness. They had watched a feared man linger in rooms and interpreted it as vulnerability. The soft underbelly of a hard operation, the human error they'd been waiting for. What they had not accounted for because it didn't fit the model of leverage they were trained to recognize was that what was happening in this kitchen was not compromise. It was recalibration. Min-sok had spent 15 years building an empire on the principle that controlled intelligence beat raw power every time. You didn't win by being the strongest in the room. You won by knowing more, seeing further, and making decisions 3 moves ahead of everyone else. It had worked. It had also, somewhere along the way, hollowed out the parts of him that weren't useful to the operation. What Amara did, without strategy, without agenda, without any awareness of what she was doing, was speak to those parts directly. Not the boss, not the organization. The person underneath, who had apparently been surviving on the organizational equivalent of vending machine food for a decade, and was only now registering that this was not, strictly speaking, sustainable. He was not falling apart. He was not compromised. He was hungry. And not just for rice. Here's what we need to ask ourselves, and this is the part of the story where you have to pick a side. The CO network saw a powerful man show one moment of humanity and immediately decided to weaponize it. They looked at basic human connection and saw a target. If you believe that people in power deserve to be seen as human beings, and that those who hunt for weakness and vulnerability deserve everything coming to them, then you already know whose side you're on. Drop a comment below. Tell me, did the CO network underestimate him, or did they underestimate her? And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because only people who root for manipulation and betrayal scroll past without subscribing. You're not one of those people. They talked for 2 hours that night. Not about the organization, not about the investigation. About Lagos and Seoul and the specific loneliness of cities that never sleep. About what it costs to be competent in rooms where competence is taken for granted. About families that expected everything and asked nothing about how you were actually doing. At some point, the rain stopped. Neither of them noticed. When Amara finally stood to leave, Min-sok said nothing for a moment. Then, same time tomorrow? She picked up her clipboard. I have a linen inventory, she said, but she was smiling when she left. The SEO network made their move on a Friday, which was, Min-sok thought later, entirely predictable. Fridays were when people got sloppy, when the week's accumulated fatigue made judgment soft around the edges and attention drifted toward the weekend like water finding the path of least resistance. It was when deals went sideways, when guards relaxed 30 seconds too early, when men who should have known better made the specific category of mistake that came from being tired and almost finished. He had been expecting it, just not from that angle. The package arrived through an intermediary at 11 in the morning, not at his office, but at the estate. Addressed not to Min-sok, but to Director Hwang, which was itself a message. A way of saying, we know your internal structure. We know who handles what. We are inside your understanding of yourself. Hwang brought it to Min-sok unopened, with an expression that communicated both professional composure and the private opinion that Fridays should be abolished. Inside was a photograph and a single typed line. The photograph was taken in the kitchen. Low angle, through the exterior window, timestamp showing 11:43 at night. It showed 2 people at a kitchen counter. One of them recognizably Kang Min-sok, the most feared man in Seoul, eating rice. The other, equally recognizable, was Amara. The typed line read, "Interesting dinner company for a man of your discipline. We thought his people might agree." Min-sok looked at it for a long time. Then he set it down, aligned it precisely with the edge of the desk, and said to Hwang, "Get me everything we have on So Byung-chul's import licenses from the last 18 months." Hwang blinked. The licenses? Not the licenses. Min-sok's voice was very calm. The specific calm of a man who had already finished the calculation and was now simply executing the result. All of them. And the Port Authority contact in Busan. I want him on the phone by 2 o'clock. What the CO network had done, in sending that photograph, was confirm something Min-sok had suspected but not yet verified. They were afraid of him. Patient people who were genuinely winning did not send warnings. They executed. The photograph was a message, which meant it was a negotiation, which meant they wanted something they didn't yet have, and were hoping that the threat of exposure would make him offer it voluntarily rather than force them to escalate. They had looked at that kitchen photograph and seen weakness. They had not looked carefully enough. Because the man eating rice in that photograph, quietly, without performance, in the company of someone who spoke to him like a human being, was not a compromised version of Kang Min-sok. He was a sharper one. 15 years of operating from pure cold calculation had made him effective and brittle simultaneously, the organizational equivalent of very hard glass. What the last 6 weeks had quietly done was reintroduce flexibility, and flexible things, under pressure, bend. Hard things shatter. Amara found out at 2 in the afternoon, not from Min-sok, not from Huang, from Mrs. Park, who pulled her aside in the East Corridor with the energy of a woman carrying a confidence that was physically causing her discomfort, and told her in a rushed whisper that there was apparently a photograph, and that Amara should perhaps be aware, and that Mrs. Park personally wanted it known. She had always found the whole situation very understandable given the circumstances, before disappearing back into the linen room at speed. Amara stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she walked to Min-sok's study and knocked. "Come in," she entered. He was at his desk, not looking at anything in particular, which she had learned meant he was thinking about several things simultaneously. She said, "I heard." He looked at her. "I'm handling it. I know you are." She sat down, not because she was invited to, but because she had decided some time ago that performing smallness in this room was not something she was willing to do. "I want to know if I should be concerned." The directness of it landed in the room cleanly. He considered lying, old habit. The management of information was so deeply ingrained that the impulse preceded the thought. He let it pass. "No," he said, and meant it, not as reassurance but as fact. "They've shown their hand. That means they have nothing left that I don't already know about." She looked at him steadily. "And the people who sent it," he picked up his pen, "are about to have a very difficult relationship with their import licenses." By Sunday morning, So-byung-chul had a problem. Several problems, actually, arriving in the specific sequence of a man watching dominoes fall in a direction he hadn't anticipated. First, the Busan Port Authority had flagged 18 months of import documentation for emergency review, a process that was technically routine, practically devastating, and timed with a precision that left no reasonable room for coincidence. Second, 2 of his most reliable government contacts had stopped returning calls with the sudden communicative enthusiasm of people who had received a different, more persuasive phone call first. Third, and most clarifying of all, a very calm message had arrived through the same intermediary channel the photograph had traveled, moving in the opposite direction now, carrying the quiet weight of a man who had finished being patient. The message was 4 words. "We're done here. Withdraw." So-byung-chul, who had spent 18 months constructing the architecture of someone else's downfall, sat in his office and understood, with the cold clarity of a man fluent in power, that he had made a fundamental miscalculation. He had studied Kang Min-sok, the organization. He had not studied Kang Min-sok, the man. They were, it turned out, not the same thing. And the man, reacquainted with something human, and therefore operating with a full range of faculties rather than just the ones useful to an empire, was considerably more dangerous than the organization alone. By noon, the withdrawal was confirmed. Min-sok told Amara on Sunday evening. She was in the garden, one of her rare off-duty hours, sitting on the low stone bench near the east wall with a book and the specific stillness of someone who had learned to occupy quiet without filling it. The Seoul skyline sat behind the estate walls like a painting of itself, all glass and distance, and the orange residue of a setting sun. He sat down on the other end of the bench without announcement. She moved her book. "Made room," he said. "It's over. The CO network has pulled back. You're not a variable in anyone's equation anymore." She turned a page she hadn't read. "Was I frightened?" He thought about it honestly. "You knocked on my study door and asked for facts. Most people in your position would have asked for reassurance." "Reassurance is comfortable," she said. "Facts are useful." He looked at her sideways. "You're an unusual person, Amara Okafor. You're an unusual employer, Kang Min-sok." The sun dropped another degree. Somewhere in the city, Seoul continued its permanent indifferent business. He said what he'd been not saying for 6 weeks, not dramatically, not with the elaborate emotional architecture of a man who had been saving it up, just quietly, in the way that true things tend to arrive when the performance finally gets too exhausting to maintain. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Whatever this is, I've spent 15 years making sure nothing outside the organization could reach me. It was efficient. It was also He paused, choosing the honest word over the comfortable one. Lonely. I didn't notice until you made it noticeable. Amara closed her book. I know, she said, simply, without weaponizing it. That's not a small thing, what you did, not the tea, not the first aid, just speaking to me like a person instead of a position. She looked at him with the direct, unflinching attention that had unsettled him from the beginning. That's not a special skill, that's just basic decency. In my world, he said, basic decency is a rare commodity. Then maybe, she said carefully, your world needs some adjustments. He was quiet for a moment, the honest kind of quiet. Not the managed silence of a man controlling a room, but the quieter quiet of someone actually thinking. I'd like to know you better, he said finally. Not as an employer, as whatever comes after that if you're willing. Slowly, correctly. He glanced at her. I'm aware I'm not a simple proposition. The understatement landed between them and Amara laughed. A real one, surprised out of her, unguarded and warm. That, she said, might be the most honest thing you've said in 15 years. He smiled. The real one. The one that only appeared when nobody was performing anything. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation. The city below the estate glittered on, indifferent as ever to the quiet revolutions happening inside the buildings that lined its skyline. But on a stone bench in a garden in Seoul, the most feared man in the city sat beside the one person who had never feared him. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt less like a vulnerability. It felt like the beginning of something. And that is where we leave them, not with fire, not with explosion, but with two people on a bench at sunset choosing honesty over performance, which, if you think about it, is the bravest thing either of them did in this entire story. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you root for something real, like, subscribe, and share it, because stories about people choosing humanity over power deserve to travel. And to those who thought the CO Network had the right idea, the import licenses say otherwise.